Hi, it's Kevin Lobates here, and today's video is on the recently published paper by Avihu Levy, that's his name, Avihu Levy's Quantum Secure Bitcoin Transactions. And it's a fascinating piece of work. It builds on something called Binohash, and it, from what I can tell at first examination, and I've only spent the morning on this, is that firstly it is indeed quantum secure, and secondly it can be implemented today on Bitcoin using just Bitcoin script code, so it doesn't require a change to the Bitcoin protocol, which is a significant achievement. However, as is always the case with these things, it comes with some compromises and trade-offs, and the big one for quantum secure Bitcoin transactions is that you need to do a bunch of proof of work to have a transaction that is valid, and it's that proof of work that creates a time window that prevents malicious attackers from seeing your transaction, modifying it, and then submitting another valid transaction that steals the coins that you are trying to spend. So this is the fundamental problem with Bitcoin script, namely that there's no real easy way to tie your outputs of your transaction to the inputs of your transaction other than through one method, and that is through a signature validation. And that signature that is validated is an ECDSA signature and is thus vulnerable to quantum computing attacks. So that's the whole problem that we're trying to overcome. And of course, the immediate obvious solution is to swap out ECDSA for a quantum secure signature scheme, and then everything else stays the same, except for one big problem, which is that quantum secure signatures are computationally intensive. They're a new technology, so they've not been tested as much as the old-time ECDSA signature, and they tend to be, well, not tend to be, they are substantially larger, kilobytes or tens of kilobytes, rather than the 65 or so bytes that an ECDSA signature is. And this has a significant impact on blockchains because it will massively inflate the size of the chain, and I'll be talking about that probably in some other video soon. Anyway, back to QSB. The neat thing that QSB and Binohash look at is the fact that you can kind of game information transfer back to the unspent transactions that you're spending from the new outputs that you're creating by cleverly using signatures in the outputs of your transaction that get fed into the oh god, this is getting far too complicated, isn't it? So one of the problems in explaining Bitcoin transactions is that they're all about what's between the senders and recipients rather than being about the transaction itself. So normally when we think of a transaction, we think of me having a £5 note and handing it to you, right? And the transaction is that physical transfer from me to you of a material object, in this case a £5 note. In Bitcoin, the transaction's kind of half complete. They're all centered around the entity that is submitting a transaction, and they take these inputs, which are previously unspent transactions, and then the entity provides script data that validates the redemption of these inputs and creates new outputs. So it's kind of more like you receiving a check and then you don't cash it until the point that you want to spend it. So I don't know if that analogy helps at all, but anyway, the transactions kind of hang there half completed until you want to spend them. Then you complete them and create a new half completed transaction that somebody else can then pick up and complete because they have the information for completing it. And they make the decision as and when they want to spend to complete that. And so you end up with this terminology about unspent transaction outputs, which become the inputs to your transaction, and you then create new unspent transaction outputs that are then used by somebody else later down the line for their spending and so on. And it's this disconnect between the inputs to your transactions, which have to be validated for you to spend, and the creation of these new outputs that then hang there waiting to be spent at a future date, that makes the whole transaction system work. It's also horribly counterintuitive for 99.9% of the population. And the issue is that your unspent transaction outputs that you're creating, you can't kind of embed data in them that is fed back to the inputs that you used to make a valid transaction, except for this one thing, which is the signatures. And I've now gone round in circles, I'm afraid, but bear with me, it's just horribly complicated. And what QSB and Binohash do is they kind of leak data back to the inputs in the form of the signature that the outputs contain. And in Binohash, the signatures are ECDSA signatures, and there's a clever mechanism whereby you have to do some proof of work to create signatures that tie the your outputs, fix them so they can't be manipulated by an attacker, and still generate a valid signature at the inputs that makes sure that those inputs can be spent to fund your outputs, as it were. And then what Levy has done with QSB is make that kind of proof of work stuff that goes on your outputs quantum secure by not relying on the properties of ECDSA anymore. So awfully hand wavy. The upshot is that to make a valid spend of your unspent transaction outputs, you have to create your transaction and then do some grinding, some proof of work to select the right subsets of signatures, and then those signatures are just validated. Oh God, this is such a hard thing to explain, but let's not get too technical. You have to do a bunch of proof of work to make a valid transaction, and that creates a time window for your transaction to get accepted onto the blockchain before the attacker has been able to do a similar kind of proof of work to create an equally valid transaction that siphons your funds off to another address instead. And it's that time window that gives you the security. And this now lets me get on to the problems I have with this scheme. So the first one is that the scripts are huge, so they're going to be expensive, and they're computationally intensive, so they're going to put pressure on the nodes as well, and therefore there will be less transaction space available in blocks. So these transactions will reduce the transactions per second that Bitcoin can handle. The second problem is we don't know in the future what kind of software and dedicated hardware that attackers might produce, and it may be financially beneficial to put some money into research and development to make this kind of attacking hardware to attack these very signatures, so that you as an ordinary person conducting transactions won't have access to this and will be spending maybe days producing your transaction, and then the attacker may be spending minutes to replicate it. So it's not a long-term secure solution if there's the financial incentive for attackers to attack it. So that was the second point there. I think those are the two main problems, really. It delays the time in which you can respond. So if you decide you want to make a transaction, you now have to do loads and loads of computation before you have a transaction ready to release. So when you see that you want to spend some Bitcoin, instead of waiting an average of 10 minutes for it to go on the block, you're also having to spend maybe hours doing this proof of work before you can create that transaction to submit. So that's fine if you're talking about generally, occasionally, casually moving your funds around. It's not going to be good if you want to respond quickly. It also doesn't tie into things like the Lightning Network and other Bitcoin constructs that have been built on top of Bitcoin, because they often rely on properties that ECDSA has that this system doesn't replicate. And then the final thing is that ultimately it's about proof of work, and as we've seen in Bitcoin mining, when there's an economic incentive, people put a lot of brain power, a lot of resources into making that process more efficient. So we end up with an arms race between people who want to just occasionally make a valid transaction and malicious attackers who are quite happy to attack all such transactions and therefore have an incentive to create new hardware and software to subvert the system. So it's a fantastically interesting academic exercise, and I'm going to revisit it to fully understand how it functions. But I think I've managed to go over it at, well, I have gone over it at a higher level than the original papers presented at, because they are very much in the vein of standard cryptographic papers. And most people, when faced with a cryptography academic paper, well, their eyes glaze over, as do mine if I'm tired. So that's the quantum secure Bitcoin transactions. It's a great achievement, a fascinating academic exercise, probably not going to have much commercial relevance in the short to mid-term, or even long-term for that matter. That's it today. I reserve the right to revisit this and correct a whole load of stuff that I've said in this video, because I've only looked at it for about 2 or 3 hours, and I'm sure there are lots of subtleties that I've overlooked and mistakes that I've made. But hopefully this gets to the gist of it, and hopefully at least some of you have found it interesting. I'll see you in the next video soon. Bye for now.